watching us right now on the Facebook live stream. Maybe I'll take a moment just to chat a minute about what we're doing here. Some of you know very well that we had planned a conference last April at which Darren had agreed to speak to give this presentation called the Wampum Chronicles. We had to postpone that due to the COVID crisis, and subsequently we rescheduled it and had to cancel that fall date again because of the ongoing pandemic. So it has taken a little bit of effort to switch to an online format, but luckily we've done so. And Darren is joining us today now from the Saint Regis Mohawk Reserve, I believe. I think that's where you are. How many people have we got in here now? Okay. I think we're good to go. So I'm going to begin this by welcoming everybody who has joined us this afternoon. My name is Dwayne Wilkin. Most of you know me by now, I'm sure, either from in-person events or now lately over the Zoom platform. I'm being assisted with today's presentation by my colleague, Glenn Patterson. Thank you, Glenn, once again for helping out with this. We're all kind of new to the Zoom world, and I know that it is not the easiest format to adjust to, but it sure helps to have a guy like Glenn. Darren Bonaparte. I first saw Darren about a year and a half ago give his presentation at a high school in Chateauguay Valley, and I don't know anybody who is so who combines historical knowledge and really artistic and performance so well. He has lectured and published extensively on Haudenosaunee history and culture over a career that has included jobs in radio, newspaper journalism, public relations, and museum management. He's the author of 2 books, and he told me recently that he managed to bang out a third one over the 2 months lockdown that we all were in the spring. Darren has served as a historical consultant for the PBS television miniseries, The War That Made America, and for the documentary, Forgotten War, The Struggle for North America. In 2018, he penned the libretto for the McGill Chamber Orchestra's musical tribute to Kateri Tegawida, the first Indigenous person to be declared a Catholic saint. Darren is currently director of the Tribal Historic Preservation Office of the Saint Regis Mohawk Tribe. You can find his many writings and research at his website, wampumchronicles.com. And at the end of this presentation, I'll put the slide up again, showing you the link to that wonderful site. So welcome, Darren. I'm going to make sure that your microphone is on, unless you can do that for me, Glenn. I'm finding it hard to switch it on.
I'm trying it, but maybe Adam, you could just turn on Darren's microphone in the bottom left of the Zoom window. Hey, good to go.
You're good to go, Darren. Welcome.
Sego. My name is Darren Bonaparte. I'm a Mohawk man, the Saint Regis Organizio, and from Haudenosaunee. And my biography pretty much said it all, so I can skip that. Most of everything is covered in the intro, other than the fact that I'm a father, I'm a husband, I have a grandchild, and 55 years old. And I just love doing this, and I'm very grateful for this opportunity to bring the Wampum Chronicles back to life. It was on standby throughout the pandemic. Very excited that this is my first presentation in months. So I feel like I'm back to my old thing. So we're getting slowly back to normal. Anyway, I'm going to jump right in. I'll have questions at the end, and if you want to write them down for later, I'll be happy to take them when I'm done. And I'm going to move very quickly through some of the belts, but I've been doing this for quite a while, so I hope I don't leave anything crucial out. Now, when my ancestors, the Mohawks of Haudenosaunee and other Mohawks and other Haudenosaunee people would come together to have meetings, there was a lot of protocol that went with it. And one of the special things that we had as part of our diplomacy and ceremonial world was the use of wampum. Now, I should note right away that wampum is not our word. It has letters in there like M and P that we do not use in Mohawk. That word comes from the Algonquian tribes that lived along the coast of New England, the Wampanoags and the Pequots and those people there, the Narragansetts. And so we're borrowing that word, but it's a common word. It's used by everybody all over the place. It's a fairly Americanized kind of word. And some people, when they hear that word wampum, they say, oh, that's the Indian money. Well, it did have a commercial value, but it had a ceremonial value too that kind of makes the fact that it had a currency a little bit more, it's more to it, there's more to it than simple currency. So because of that ceremonial aspect, it was a way to bring the creator of the universe into your presence when you conduct your diplomacy. When you're meeting with other nations, you're on your best behavior and you bring your best things forward, because what you're doing is going to last for generations afterward. Usually you're making peace or reconfirming peace. So it's as though the creator of the universe is right there with you. So we bring our best stuff. Now, to get back to wampum, well, what is wampum? Well, actually, it comes from the coast of the Atlantic Ocean, New England, and it comes from two shells. You probably will recognize these right away. This is a whelk, and this is a quahog clamshell. And if you go to the beach today in New England, you're going to stumble upon these. They're just all over the place. Usually find quahogs right where freshwater rivers meet the ocean. They call it brackish water. So the tribal people that lived along the coast would make all kinds of little ornaments from these shells. They would make beads and different things. They would decorate themselves. They were quite fond of that. When the colonists arrived to set up their colonies along the coast, they traded with the natives that they met. They learned all kinds of things about the new climate, the new environment, what crops would grow. And so there was quite an exchange of knowledge between them. Well, one thing that the native people didn't have any use for was the currency that the colonists brought with them. So they had to think, well, what can we introduce into this trade that they will really like? And so they looked and saw how much they prized things from the sea, the shells. And so they decided, let's use our metal tools, our drills, our grindstones, and see if we can't produce something that we can trade with the natives made of that stuff that they prize so much. So they came up with tubular beads. And I'll show you an example of them. This is what we call tubular wampum beads. They first came up with the white beads, and these were really popular, and all the native people loved it, couldn't wait to get their hands on it. Then about 20 or 30 years later, I'm not sure exactly how long it took, but then they introduced the purple, or sometimes called black wampum, which was also very popular. So you had the dark and the light wampum that combined. And so the native people living along the coast would incorporate these commercialized tubular beads into their crafts. And then they got their hands on the tools themselves, and they began to manufacture a wide variety of different beads that they could use. But it's those tubular beads that we know today in the belts, and that's the most popular form, but there were many different forms. And so that was just a way that the colonists and the natives came together to share culture, to share technology, and create something new. So wampum is a product of both Indigenous culture and European technology. So those two things combined. I'm standing in front of my display of handmade reproduction wampum belts and strings that I use when I give talks about the culture. So let's get right into that. How was it done? How was it used? What was the protocol that went with it? Well, if you can follow me down to the end of the rack, we'll start with the most famous belt of all. And if you know anything about the Haudenosaunee, you'll know that this wampum is probably the most significant and important wampum of all. It's what we call the Iroquois, and it represents Iroquois, who was an Onondaga chief. And some people say he had some Mohawk ancestry too. I don't know, but he was one of the people that united the 5 nations of the Iroquois into one confederacy. And so they made a belt to commemorate that act and a special role of Iroquois. There's a big, long story that goes into the founding of the confederacy, but due to time constraints, I can't really go into it too much, other than to say that the legend itself speaks of a dark time in our past when the 5 nations were bitter enemies. And they eventually made peace, probably to confront some change, maybe another enemy nation in the distance, or perhaps even European colonization, because that's the latest trend in archaeology, is to suggest that European contact might have inspired the 5 nations to unite, to have a stronger unified front for anything that may come. Because when Europeans came, those Algonquian tribes that lived along the coast were encouraged to use the tools and the weapons that they were given by the colonists to expand their own domain into the interior, and came up against the 5 nations. So this belt talks about the 5 nations bonded together, and it takes the form of a chain, and there's links in the chain, and at the center is a tree, the great tree piece, the white pine, that was uprooted when these nations came together to make peace. So it became a symbol of the great law that united the 5 nations. So if you turn it the other way, it becomes a heart at the center. And this was one of the old traditions about the belt, is that when the 5 nations came together, they shared one heart, one mind, one spirit. They were united as if in one whole family, and they lived in one symbolic longhouse together. So at the end of the longhouse, in the east, were the Mohawks, the Ganyangahada, people of the Flint. West of them were the Oneidas, the Standing Stone people. At the center were the Onondagas, the people of the hills, and that's where the Great Tree of Peace was planted when they came together. West of Onondaga, at Cayuga Lake, were the Cayuga people, and they were sometimes called the Big Pipe people or the Big Swamp people. And then further up in the western end of what is now New York State, we have the Senecas, and they were also called the Big Mountain people. So they formed the western door of the Great Longhouse that came to be known as the Iroquois or the Haudenosaunee. That's what Haudenosaunee translates to, is people of the extended lodge. So in those old times, we lived in bark lodges that could be, that were 20 feet tall, 20 feet wide, and up to 300 feet long. I mean, you can just imagine what these things must have looked like. So anyway, so that's the little crash course in the founding of the Confederacy as depicted in this grand wampum known as the Iroquois. So I'm going to put that back on the rack. Now, the important thing about the way wampum was used in culture is it was displayed on a rack. They would have wooden poles set up in the square of the village, in the center place of the native village, and people would gather for the councils. But before they even entered the village, there was a special thing that happened. Now, around the native village was the cornfields and all the vegetables that they grew. And further beyond the cornfields were the woods, the forests. So visitors, when they would come to a council, would camp out at the wood's edge, just beyond the cornfields. They would light a fire to let the people in the village know that they're there, ready for council. So somebody would go out, usually a chief, greet the people and welcome them and lead them into the village. But before they led them into the village, they would offer a few words of condolence. And they would say to the people, I gotta go and grab some wampum strings here to show this. They would say to the visitors by holding up wampum, and they didn't always use wampum to do this, but mostly they did. They would hold up a string and they would say, I can see that the people have gathered and that there's grief, there's sadness and sorrow in your eyes. We can tell this. We know that you have suffered since the last time we came together. So with this string of wampum, I wipe the tears from your eyes so that you can see clearly again. You will see that you are surrounded by friends and smiling faces. And then I take this string and I unblock your hearing so that you can hear the good words that are being spoken. You can hear the singing, you can hear the children laughing, and you'll know that even though you are in grief, creation calls you to come out of it and to join the laughter, to sing again, to be happy again. Your days of sorrow are quickly passing from you. Then with this last string of wampum, I give you water to clear your throat so that those hard feelings that you carry inside of you do not prevent you from speaking, from singing, from laughing, from joining in the things of life. So they would say these words to the visitors to kind of erase all the hard negative feelings that they may have. And so that they don't bring those hard feelings into the village and upset the people that have gathered. So it was a way to bring everybody to a place of healing so that they could conduct diplomacy on a good, positive note without having a lot of animosity and anger. So they would deal with that before anything happened. So those strings were very important. And this process was so important that the Europeans learned this too. And even French officers were given strings of wampum along with their uniform so that whenever they had to encounter any native people, they could recite those little words of condolence to them. And it was a way of making things go a little bit easier for them. So that's something I learned from a reenactor in Quebec a few years ago. Anyway, I'm going to put those on the rack. Now, when they would come together for a council, everyone would assemble in the center of the village, and there'd be a fire lit and burning in the center. That would be the symbolic council fire. But there would be a wooden rack set up, stuck in the ground with a pole attached to the top, just like we have here. At the beginning, there would be no wampum belts on the rack. It would just be poles stuck in the ground. And then, once everybody had been gathered together and words of welcome were passed over, a speaker would get up and begin to present the first in a series of wampum belts. Now, before the council even began, back in the home nations, everyone would be planning what do you say at the meeting. The chiefs, the clan mothers, the wampum makers, they would all gather together and they would decide what speech are we going to deliver at the council. What are the issues that we have? So they would decide which wampum belts should be woven for this special occasion. And they would decide what symbols would appear in the wampum belts. And then they would practice the speech that is to be spoken while the belts are being presented. So they would gather all this together and take it with them to the council. And if you were invited to the council to present and speak, this would all be what you would do ahead of time. And the other nations would do the same too. So that first speaker would get up in front of the crowd and somebody would hand him a wampum belt and he would hold it up in front of everybody as he delivered his speech so that everybody, including the people way in the back row, in the cheap seats, they would hear it and see it and be able to pick up. So while you're listening intently to the speaker, you're also looking at the visual of the wampum belt so that those two things become joined in your mind. Because the wampum belt doesn't mean anything if you don't know the speech that went with it. So that's one of the problems about people finding wampum belts in museums. A lot of times the story that was said at the time it was delivered is not there. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. But that's how oral tradition had a little bit of a mnemonic device to go along with it. And it wasn't just natives that did this. We weren't the only people that wove wampum. The colonists also. The Dutch did it. The French did it. The English also did it. And the English actually kind of took it to another level. But anyway, so that's what was presented. So in this particular book, this one is a commemoration of the first Europeans that came to North America, according to the one kind of this bell. And the symbolism, the diagonal bar represents a pole that props up a house. Those old bark longhouses usually were only good for about 30 years. They start to kilter and decay. So they would take a pole and prop up the outside wall to keep it from tipping over. Probably your grandpa used to do this with an old shed behind the house. So you've got 10 more years out of it. So that's what those leaning diagonal bars are. They're supports, they're props, they help. They're a way of offering support to someone else. The diagonal bar is the most popular and common motif in wampum belts. There's an old black and white photo, you can probably find it on the internet, that has about 9 or 10 white wampum belts with purple diagonal bars on it. So you know it's a very common symbol for wampum. So this one, because of the Europeans being so few, the native people supported them and propped them up. But as time went by, the natives were outnumbered by the colonists. But we'll get to that later. Now, eventually, those Europeans that set up colonies along the coast made their way into the interior to the Hudson River, to the Mohawk River, where our ancestors, the Mohawks, at one time lived. And so when we first encountered these Europeans, we were mystified by them. Their appearance was different. They had different goods with them, and the vessel that they showed up in, the little sailing ships, were unknown to us. We didn't know what they were. So we were curious about them. And we had also heard that some of the other nations now had new tools and new weapons that we needed to get. So as soon as these Europeans showed up in our area, we approached them. And it didn't go very well because the natives who were already dealing with them said, those are the Mohawks, they're very evil, and you should kill them as soon as they show up. So it did not go very well at first, but eventually we entered into a relationship with the colonists. We began to trade with them and get some of those goods that they had, the axes, the metal things. And you can see that depicted in this belt. Here's a European colonist, and he's got an axe in his hand. And over on the other end is the native, and he's not holding anything. So what this represents is what they call the covenant chain of peace and friendship between the colonists and the natives. And the metaphor for that was that the Europeans had tied their ship to the shore with a rope to a tree. But as time went by, the rope wasn't good enough, so they replaced it with an iron chain that they tied around a rock on the shore. And the rain fell on the iron chain and began to rust. So they decided to replace it with a silver chain. And they tied that around the mountain to make it even stronger. And then they wrapped wampum around the chain. So that's just an evolving metaphor. It sounds kind of silly, but it really wasn't. It was all metaphor and symbols. It was what was our stock and trade. So you see a lot of these kind of covenant chain belts. Sometimes they look exactly like a chain. It's got links in it. Sometimes a long band between them. Sometimes it's a bunch of diamonds or squares or rectangles just in a row, not even connected. But they all represent that same principle of the covenant chain of peace and friendship. Sometimes you hear it called the silver covenant chain, because that was the ultimate result of the chain, is that it evolved to become a silver thing that needed to be shined and polished. In other words, you need to keep the tradition, keep the trade goods flowing back and forth, to keep that spirit of positive trade going. So the most common metaphor for that was the chain. Now, chains are a curious thing, because what do you associate chains with besides ships? Well, slaves. Slaves are often chained. And that's the other dark side of colonization, is that those European colonists brought with them people who were enslaved from Africa. But slavery was not unknown among the among the North American Native people is we conducted warfare. We would capture people and then bring them into our communities. And the ones that we really liked, we would adopt and bring them into our own. But others were actually more left to servitude, and we would, put them to work. And maybe at some point they would be adopted. But when the Europeans came in, they would offer us bounties for some of those captive Native people. And it's just kind of becoming known today in Canada that slavery was a big component of New France. And today, when we talk about slavery, most people think of the American South, Georgia and all those places. But slavery was all over North America. And it's something that we have to address today because Native people were involved in it, the French, the British, the Dutch, everybody. So it's one of those dark things of our past that we're now just starting to address and face. So I'm very positive about that because history isn't all just muskets and powder horns and all the cool stuff. There's a lot of dark things that happen in the past. So the covenant chain of peace and friendship, double-edged sword on that one. So I'm going to put that back up. So when that chief is up giving a speech, holding up the wampum belt, when he's done with that part of the speech, he puts the belt on the rack. It's now up there. It's in play. So he would go through his whole speech, one by one, talking about all the different things. And he would put them up on the rack. And then when he's done, everybody would maintain perfect silence. Nobody would say a word. They would wait for that speaker to sit down and think. Did he forget anything? And they would give him that time to review in his own mind. And then if he gives them the word that he's done for sure, then they may break the council for the day because he might have been up there all day talking. Depends on how many belts he brought, how many speeches he had to give along with those belts. So they would take a break, maybe have a big feast or whatever. People would talk about the belts that were presented. The nation receiving those belts would have to discuss how to reply when it was their turn. So when the council resumed, sometimes later in the day or maybe even the next day, because it was improper to conduct business after noon, because they say that high noon and beyond is the time of the dark spirits that are not conducive to diplomacy. So they would usually wait till the morning. So the nation that had received those belts would get up, and the chief would go to the rack, and he would take that first belt down, and he would basically repeat what had been said the day before by that first chief. And so that everybody knew, yeah, he really listened, he heard every point, he's got it. Then he would either accept that belt or reject it. If he accepted it, he would just take it, hand it to one of his fellow chiefs, they'd roll it up, put it in a pouch, take it home. They would keep it. Because they may have to break it out later to remind somebody of a promise made with wampum. Because that was sacred, you didn't go against that. So if they rejected that message on the other hand, they would do something very dramatic with the belt. They would either drop it on the ground, maybe put it back on the rack, or perhaps throw it right at the chief who presented it. And that was just pageantry. It was drama. It was really to get the point to everyone there that that belt had not been successful, it had been rejected. So if you threw a belt in the face of some of the chief, he wouldn't get mad and punch you out. He would just take the belt, roll it up, and he would probably think to himself, man, I don't want that to happen again. Next time we'll think a little bit better about what we're presenting. But that's how it was done. Chiefs would get up presenting belts, and then the other chiefs would have to reply and respond to it. So then once they've gone through all the belts that have been presented, then they would present their own belts to whatever other nation. So they would break out their belts and go through them one by one. So that's how it was done. That's how the wampum diplomacy was conducted, and it could take as long as a week to get through all the speeches and all the belts. And it was a big event. And you usually had one big council fire every summer to deal with all the matters that had to be brought forward. And a lot of times it was just to reaffirm peace that had already been made. So that's in a nutshell how Treaty Council was conducted. And I have to stress that it wasn't just a native thing. The colonists also did this. New France did it, New Sweden, the Dutch, and also the English. They all had people who would learn native languages and native customs and dress head to toe in native finery and come to the council with their own belts already woven. And they would have to conduct it and deliver it in our manner. See, that it's 180 degrees today where our chiefs, whenever they have business with the outside, they have to wear a business suit, carry a briefcase, fly to Washington or Ottawa, go sit at a big mahogany table, and conduct business the way the outside world does. Well, in the old days, everybody did it the way we did it. It was the native style of governance that happened in those days. So our people had their own customs and religion and belief systems that were all tied up in a wampum. Well, something happened along this way of natives interacting with colonists. Eventually, they tried to use missionaries to introduce Christianity to our people. In fact, they made it mandatory. If you wanted to buy a firearm from the colonists, you kind of had to have one of those little crosses hanging around your neck. You had to at least show that you were interested in the new faith that's being introduced. So you see this in this belt, which definitely dates back to New France. You see there's a cross at the center of the belt. There's even a church at the end. It's pretty obvious. And these are the native people on one side of the cross, and then there's the missionaries, and they're all wearing long robes that reach the floor. So that was the curious thing about the Jesuit priests, that they wore these long robes. They called them black robes. So on this belt, you see them uniting at a mission. And each mission had a cross in the center of the village. And you can even see they've woven the church into this belt. I haven't figured out what the symbol on the end is yet. Maybe someday I will. So this is a belt that represents the missionary work that happened in New France. It was very controversial. Not everyone accepted it. Sometimes sparked war. Now, eventually, the French. Now I gotta kind of backtrack a little bit. The French came up the St. Lawrence River, and that's nowhere near where we lived, because we were a little bit south in what is now New York State. So they made friends with all the natives that lived along the St. Lawrence River. Many of those were our enemies, the Algonquins, the Micmacs, you name it. They were ancient enemies of the Haudenosaunee. And so they made allies with the French first. Meanwhile, we're allies with the Dutch and later the English, because they came up right into our territory. So it ended up becoming a world war, and wars that were going on in Europe spilled over into North America, and we got caught up in it. Because when your ally, your colonial ally, goes to war against another colony, you go to war with another colony. You go to war against their native allies. So basically, that was the battlefield of North America. Is native people fighting on the side of the French, other native people fighting on the side of the English, and so it's basically a chess tournament taking place in North America. We're just pawns, and eventually that chess tournament resulted with just the French and the English battling it out. So at one point, though, the French decided the Haudenosaunee are hurting our fur trade, because the French focus a lot of their efforts on the fur trade. They were in the north, so the planting season wasn't very long. So they decided to focus a lot of their effort and attention on the fur trade. So in order to have a successful fur trade, you need to keep native alliances in place where they are, so that they can bring the furs out of the forest to the trading posts. So that's how they did it. And the main route at one time was the St. Lawrence River, which is right here in Akwesasne. And so when some of the French's Huron native allies would bring their furs down the St. Lawrence River in canoes, the Mohawks would attack them and steal their furs and take them down to the Dutch and sell them to them. So the French said, that's hurting our economy. We can't have that. We need to battle them. So at first they thought, well, let's try diplomacy. Let's send missionaries right to the heart of the 5 nations, to Onondaga, and see if we can win them over that way. So they established a mission. It was only there for a couple of years. When the Mohawks, the keepers of the eastern door of the Great Longhouse, heard about this, they went all the way to New France, and they confronted the governor. And they said to him, don't you know that our symbol for our confederacy is the Great Longhouse? There's only doors on the end. What you have done is crawl through the smoke hole at the center of the house. You should have gone through the door like any normal person. Aren't you afraid that the smoke will cause you to lose your sight and lose your footing and fall into the fire? So basically what they're saying is you really blundered. You should have come through the Mohawks if you want to have alliance with the whole confederacy, because we're the founding nation. We're the original people of this alliance. So we guard the eastern door. So the French withdrew that mission from Onondaga. It was only there 2 or 3 years, and then they abandoned it. And so later on, the people wove a wampum belt, according to one version of this belt, that this represented the missionaries coming a long way from the land of the cross, New France. But they had an ulterior motive. They had a darkness in their heart. And this symbol at the bottom of the individual represents the great council fire of the Onondagas, the capital of the Confederacy. There's other versions of this spell. Some say this spell represents Moravian missionaries who came to Onondaga. Others say that this represents the great peacemaker coming from Skyward with the great law to teach it to all of the people of Turtle Island. That's a more modern, recent interpretation that was, I believe, interpreted by Chief Jake Thomas of the Six Nations Reserve. But you don't see that mentioned in the historical records. Anyway, so I'm going to get to another important belt. But before I tell you that, I have to tell you about those Mohawks again. The Mohawks that confronted the governor and told them about how they violated protocol continue to fight against the French, continue to seize their furs and bring it to Albany to trade with the Dutch and the English. And so eventually the French decided we need to, the other 4 Iroquois are interested in trade with us, but the Mohawks are the holdouts. So let's send an army down there and teach them a lesson. Well, the first army they sent got lost in the woods and froze, so they weren't able to attack us. But the following autumn, they got reinforcements, and so they sent an even bigger army directly right to the heart of Mohawk villages. It was in the fall of 1666, the year of the beast, as I call it, and they burned all the Mohawks from east to west. All the villages burned into the ground. Our people were able to escape at the last minute and take refuge probably among the Oneidas and the Onondagas. In the following year, we decided to rebuild our villages, only this time we're not going to be as antagonistic against the French. We're going to open diplomacy. So the French, the following year, sent missionaries to Mohawk country and began to teach some of our people their new faith. Now, among the Mohawks at the time, the Hurons and Algonquins that we had captured and adopted into our villages, they were already Catholics because they lived up in New France. So the missionaries at first tended to them, but then more and more Mohawks began to take an interest in these new teachings, these new songs, these new ceremonies. Because with all of the epidemics that we had suffered prior to that, a lot of those ceremonies and things that we were used to had kind of faded away. It was a really dark time for the culture. So I think a lot of the Native people gravitated to the missionaries because they were offering ritualized experience. They had choirs for women, for children, for men, and they had holy families and all different kinds of structure that they offered. So I think a lot of people gravitated to that because it reminded them of what they used to have. And another thing about the Jesuits that was very crafty for them was they studied our creation stories. They learned as much as they could about our creation story,
because they were listening for things in common with their teachings. For instance, in our creation story, we talk about another world in the sky called Sky World. We call that Velokiage in Mohawk. Well, when they decided to translate the Lord's Prayer into Mohawk, they chose that word for Sky World to represent heaven in the Lord's Prayer. So when we say the Lord's Prayer in Mohawk, even today, we say Velokiage, which connects it to our own sky world. So the Jesuits are very crafty about that. They were wise to listen to our stories and our culture for things that we had in common with them that they could link to. So that's how they did it. And eventually, they established a new Indian village right up near Montreal on the prairie. And they began to invite Iroquois people, Haudenosaunee people, to go up there and live, to be closer to the trade, to be a part of New France. So at first, it was Onondagas and Oneidas who went, and then a lot of Mohawks began to go up there too. Probably the most famous of the Mohawk converts was a young woman, the daughter of a chief, whose name was Degaquita, which means she feels her way or something to that effect. She had had smallpox as a child and had poor eyesight in daylight. So that young woman was baptized, given the name Catherine, or as we thought, Gadeli. So Gadeli de Gaquita was one of those early Mohawks who went to New France and settled at the native village that they established on the prairie. Well, by then they had already moved to what is now called St. Catherine and established a new village there, just a village of native people. So the first people were Iroquois and Hurons living at that village. But eventually the Hurons decided there's just too many people here, plus we don't quite get along all the time. So they decided to move to Wendague, which was another village at Quebec City. But before they left, they give this great wampum to the people of Ganawage, which is what they call the new Mohawk village on the St. Lawrence. And they draped this over the rafters above the altar in the chapel that they had in the village. And it was an admonition to the Mohawks to maintain their faith and their alliance with the French and to guard against the demons that always try to destroy that which we build. And so this wampum bell was a special part of their chapel. And another thing that they urged the people to do was to build a real church, not continue to have mass in a bark longhouse, but to have carpenters build them a real solid wooden church, which they did. And once that church was built, they attached this bell to the rafters above the beams above the altar, just like it had been in the earlier version of the church. So whenever the church was destroyed in a tornado a few years later, and they rebuilt it, again, that bell was given that place of honor. And then when they moved their village 2 or 3 times to the west, again, the bell had that special place of honor. And it was even on display in the current church in Ganawage up until the 1970s when some teenagers apparently broke into the church and stole the bell. And it hasn't been seen since. Well, not by other people. I think whoever stole it probably saw it later, but we don't know where it is. If you ever see it, call McGruff the crime dog and we'll make sure it gets home. Anyway, hopefully it still exists. Now you notice that's a big bell. That is a really massive bell. I think it's about 7,000 beads or more. And the size of the bell represents the commitment and the importance of what is being said in the bell. Another important thing about the bell is that it has, like a lot of the missionary bells, it has a cross in the center, very prominent cross. It also has 2 rows, actually 4 rows of white that go through the rest of the bell. And it creates a negative space, 3 rectangles on each side. So if you add the 3 rectangles and the cross and the 3 on the other end of the bell, that adds up to 7. Now, 7 was a sacred number to the Catholics. If you ever open up the Bible and read the New Testament, you're going to see 7 repeated over and over and over. There's the 7 days of the week. There's the 7 letters that Paul wrote to the 7 churches. Just endless repetition of that sacred number 7. And according to Catholics, 7 represents perfection. So it was a very special number to the Native people also, because one of the important constellations of the North is the Big Dipper. To us, it's not a dipper, it's a great bear being pursued by 3 hunters. And if you can see the Big Dipper, you will always know where the North Star is. So it was a very important constellation for traditional people to know, to orient themselves of how to travel and how to get around. So they knew how important that was. And the Big Dipper is made up of 7 stars. There's 4 of the bear, and then the 3 in the ladle that represent the hunters chasing the big bear. And they say in the fall, when the Big Dipper is closest to the earth, it represents when the hunters are able to hit the bear with their arrows, causing blood and fat to drip onto the treetops, which cause them to change color at the bottom. So interesting little fact about that. And actually the rotation of the Big Dipper around the North Star throughout the year goes in a counterclockwise direction. And it represents, it has come to become symbolized in all kinds of different artifacts and decorations. It looks like a whirlwind pattern. And even the famous swastika that Adolf Hitler hijacked for the Third Reich was an actual ancient native symbol that he stole. And this symbol is found all over the world. It really represents the Big Dipper rotating around the North Star throughout the year. Interesting little fact. Anyway, so 7 was real important. And 7 came to represent to us, we chose that number for the 7 nations of Canada, a new alliance that our ancestors created on the St. Lawrence River with all the tribes that lived along the St. Lawrence. And it came to be known in our language as Jaga, Nahono, and Jage, 7 nations or 7 lands. And so at first, though, it was just a few villages up and down the river. So now I'm going to get to, I want to backtrack a little bit, if you don't mind. I want to talk about some of these other points. This is going back to the traditional culture of the British. This represents the dish or bowl with 1 spoon. And you see this a lot. You see a lot of other Native people have replicas of this bell. It basically represents that the natural world has all that we'll ever need. You know, it provides enough food and shelter, clothing that, you know, we'll never run out of. So everyone is welcome to peacefully partake. If somebody is hunting in your hunting grounds, you can't attack them. You actually have to be nice to them and help them. So that's what this represents. When you accept a bell like this, as you're agreeing that you will live in peace and share from the bounty of nature without harming anyone. So there's no knife in the bowl, it's just a spoon. And this bell represents the fact that the Haudenosaunee people and a lot of other of the Iroquois tribes were matrilineal, that the women had a special role in our culture. Doesn't mean we're matriarchal, and that's a whole different ball of wax. Matrilineal is a different thing. So in our culture, our chiefs represent a particular clan. So it is said that this bell, which is a Seneca bell actually, has clan mothers raising up a male, because they're the ones that watch the little guys. They know which ones have the right qualities to be a chief someday. They gotta be kind, they have to be patient, they have to be humble, they have to be generous, they have to always be thinking of others, they have to be altruistic. So they know which of the kids are like that, and they will groom that kid to grow up to be a chief. So the clan mothers know. Their decision has to be affirmed and supported by the other clan mothers. So that's what I think is represented here, is the other clan mothers, the other clans. Among the Mohawk originally, there was just turtle, bear, and wolf. So they all had to work together. And then there's other clan mothers on this at the far ends. And what I think that represents are the clan mothers of the other nations, because they all have to affirm the choice of a chief. He's not just a clan chief, he's not just a nation chief, he's a confederacy chief. And he's going to represent the entire confederacy. So they have to have a say in those chiefs and who select them. They have to approve that. And then when that chief dies, those nations have to come in to do the ceremony to raise up a new chief. So that's when they have their say. So it's a very important process that continues on through time. And this thing that I have at the center of my display is what we call the circle wampum. This is the 50 chiefs of the Iroquois Confederacy who come to the council for big meetings. And they all carry with them the fire of their clan. It's not like they carry a torch, it's symbolizing, it's just a symbol for their spirit. So they all come together and they themselves are the great council. Even though there isn't an actual fire burning when they meet, they themselves are the great council fire. And you see that there's two bands that kind of intertwine around the outside. Well, that's their arms linked together. Chiefs are all facing the center, and their arms are linked together like a human chain. And that's actually the origin of the covenant chain, is human beings linking their arms together, long before we learned of metal chains. So this longest strand represents the Onondaga chief, and this bunch of chiefs here are the Onondagas. And each nation sits in a group in the circle. And so that is the chief of the Onondagas, who is the wampum keeper of the Confederacy. He's the guy that repairs the belts, make it whole. He's the one that commissions new belts if any new ones need to be made. But his primary function is to memorize all the speeches that go with the belts, to make sure that he has somebody training to learn and continue to carry that on. All of the chiefs had younger chiefs and young men who were their trainees who would take that on when they died. So that was just a way of keeping that story going on and on forever. Now I want to bring up something else that goes with this. It's what we call a condolence game. And if you can look carefully at this, you'll see there's pegs, 5 groups of pegs. And there's also little symbols carved with each peg. These represent the names of the 50 chiefs from the founding. And they're all depicted, they're all different. And when a chief dies, they take his peg out. And they don't replace it until a new chief is raised up to take the place of the chief that died. So when that ceremony is all done, they bring the whole Confederacy together for it, so that they all approve it. That's what they do, is they put the peg back in there. Now this is just a model of the condolence cane. So the missing pegs don't mean that right now there's a dead chief somewhere. It's just that, well, the pegs broke and on this particular cane. So eventually I'll get it fixed. But I can't even tell you today how many real pegs would be in the official cane for the Confederacy. I don't know the exact roll call on how many chiefs need to be raised up, what that status is. I'm not privy to that because I'm not part of it. But they know. Anyway, so those two things go together. And I should mention the handle on this one kind of looks like an eagle. Well, at the top of the tree of peace at Onondaga, where the council fires are handled, symbolically they placed a bald eagle to sit on top of that white pine to survey the distance from all the way around, looking for any danger. If the eagle senses danger approaching, he cries out, and the men hear that. And they say, that's why we have eagle feathers on our stove. You see, I got 3 eagle feathers because of the Mohawk. That's the current feather regime for Mohawks. So we all hear the call of the eagle when he cries out that danger is approaching, and we rally, we come together to defend. So moving on now, I skipped a belt as I was rolling through there. I missed the T-row, which is a very popular belt. And if you go to any place in the Confederacy, you'll see the Hiawatha belt. You'll also see the 2-row wampum. Well, this is one of many 2-row wampum replicas that exist. And there's a different array of beads. But the common thing is that there's always a parallel wampum beads, 2 rows of it. The popular story today is that when we first met Europeans, we saw that they had a sailing ship. We paddled around in canoes. So we chose that as a symbol to say, you stay in your sailing ship, you keep your culture, your language, your way of life, your governance, everything. It's good for you, so that stays with you. In our canoe, we have our own way of that. We have our own religion, our own language, our own customs. What's good for us may not be good for you. What's good for you may not be good for us. So as long as we abide in our own vessels, don't try to interfere in the steering of the other, we can sail side by side down the river of life in peace and harmony and friendship. So that's a common story that we hear Haudenosaunee people today. Unfortunately, you can't find any verification of that in the colonial record. There's no description of that in any of the hundreds of pages of speeches that still exist from the colonial era. So some people think it might be a more modern perspective that is being brought to it. And that is probably right, because in this boat and canoe thing, there's a sense of equality. But our ancestors did not see the Europeans as our equals. In the original metaphor of the covenant chain of peace and friendship, the symbol for the European was always a ship tied to the shore. But we represented the tree that it was tied to with a rope. Then we represented the rock that it was tied to with an iron chain. Then we were the mountain that the silver chain was tied to. The Europeans stayed in the ship. So what that says to me is that we were the land, and that the Europeans were still temporary. That they could, if we didn't like how they conducted themselves, we could unchain them and let them drift back down where they came from. So there's a different sense. It isn't an equal brother partnership. We are the land. These are people in a boat that are just tied to us temporarily. So it's a different mentality that our ancient ancestors had about Europeans. So they were always on a temporary testing. Let's keep an eye on them and see how it goes. So it's not quite the same like the kumbaya 2-row wampum thing of you're in your canoe and I'm in my boat, whatever. I hate to debunk a real popular belt, but hey, that's what I'm here for. Anyway, so here's another big belt. In fact, this belt is the biggest belt known to exist today. The real version of this belt is in the McCord Museum in Montreal, which is undergoing a big renovation, either now or in the near future. But in their vaults, they have the original of this belt. And if my puny arms can withstand the weight of this, I'll hold it up for you. This was made by the people of Haudenosaunee. And this past Saturday was the 30th anniversary of what we call the Oka crisis. But what it really was a military and police raid of Haudenosaunee Mohawk territory. Happened in 1990. Anyway, Haudenosaunee on the Ottawa River, when they established their village, they made this belt. And it was a custom at the time when you made a village, you made a wampum belt to represent its charter, its laws, its rules. So this was the belt that they made. And they said, to protect it from any evil people, we lay this on the ground and cover it with earth. In other words, they bury it. They connect it to the land. So it's basically the rules. If you want to live in that land, you got to abide by this rule. So you'll see the cross at the center of the belt, and there's different people holding hands. There were actually 3 different nations that lived at Oka. There were Algonquins, Nipissings, and Iroquois that lived in relative peace in that village. But they were all Catholics. It was a Catholic mission. And at the end of that belt, you see white dogs. And they say that those dogs are the guardians of the village. They will bark if any intruder or any enemy approaches. And another interesting thing about the white dogs is that the Haudenosaunee people had a ceremony called the White Dog Ceremony. And that was basically a sacrifice to the Creator. And they would burn tobacco along with a little white dog in a fire. And they don't do that anymore because I don't know, we like little white dogs. Well, they got rid of it anyway. But we still burn tobacco and give thanks to the Creator. So that's an homage to that ceremony, I believe. Anyway, so I'm going to put that back in the belt. Back in the rack. Now, the rest of the belts, I think we're probably getting to the end of the time here. I don't have a clock visible, but my internal clock is telling me we're getting to the end. So I'm going to go quickly through the rest of these belts. And I hope my ancestors will forgive me. Anyway, this is a big belt that's in New York City today. And it represents New France because they purchased it from somebody up in Canada. It has diamonds and hexagons and also house-shaped emblems on one end. And there's also a little cross in the center of every symbol. So what that represents is the different nations, Algonquian tribes and Iroquois tribes, who came to live at the Saint Regis River in New France and accepted Christianity and also lived in peace with the colonists. So that's the European style house. So they're all living along the river. The only thing united is their faith. Now, the Mohawks who moved to the Saint Regis River eventually decided that they would create a new confederacy, just like they had back in the Mohawk Valley with the other Iroquois. So they created what was called the Seven Nations of Canada. And that's represented by another belt that's in the McCord Museum today. But this is a replica of that belt. And if you look carefully, there's 7 emblems from one end to the other, and they're all linked together like a chain. There's that covenant chain again. But what is the symbol that's in the center of the white square? Well, it looks to me like a turtle. There's his shell, there's his head, front legs, hind legs, and his tail. There's his cross, because just like this one, there's a cross at the side. It's Catholic turtle, by the way. So turtle is also from our creation story. In our creation story, Sky Woman came to Earth and gently was lowered onto the back of a turtle. So again, turtle representing the land. So it's very appropriate that the Catholic Mohawk people remembered their creation story in this stuff. So I think that's a significant thing. Even though they accepted Christianity and a whole bunch of new teachings, they still maintain knowledge of their original culture. And that is not to be forgotten. You must always remember. This Seven Nations of Canada eventually went to war against the Iroquois Confederacy in a number of the wars of the late 1600s and early 1700s. In the middle of the 1700s, the French and Indian War, or the 7 Years' War, broke out, and we ended up fighting against Mohawks who were in the old Confederacy, fighting against the Seven Nations. When that war came to an end, we had to make peace with them. And also, the British won that war, as we all know. And so a big peace council was held in Montreal or Ganawagi. I'm not quite sure which. Most people say Ganawagi. And that is when we probably received this belt from the British. Because there's an old tradition about this belt that was recorded about 1880s that said the 2 emblems at the center are the chief of the Seven Nations and the King of England holding hands in friendship. And the 2 animals at the end are said to be wolves, but they might be dogs. And the bands on the end represent the Seven Nations of Canada. So there's other interpretations of that belt, but that is one that is actually documented in an old book published in 1892. So it was captured from a woman here in Haudenosaunee who held the belt. It belonged to an ancestor of, I think, even her father, and he was a chief. So she knew the actual story. That's why I stand behind that interpretation. And she didn't sell the belt either. The person who wanted to buy it was a Civil War general. She wasn't intimidated. She refused to sell it. But later, when she died, her nephew inherited the belt, and he sold it to a rich white lady who showed up and wanted to buy the belt, and he sold it to her. It ended up in the New York State Museum in Albany for about a century, and we repatriated it back to Haudenosaunee. That might have been about 10 years ago, not too long ago. And so it's here in Haudenosaunee. You can see it at the Haudenosaunee Museum if you ever come to visit. So another belt probably passed across the fire at that big peace council in Ganawagi. This is another McCord Museum belt you can see. And there's a famous lithograph of a Huron chief holding this belt. I can't remember the guy's name offhand, but you see there's a diamond representing a council fire, and there's a hatchet. So they buried the hatchet at the Great Council Fire in Ganawagi. move quickly, the Seven Nations gave the Iroquois Confederacy at that time this belt. So you see the 7 crosses in it. And it was a gesture of peace to say, you know, we have done battle against each other throughout the war, but that's over now, we're friends. So that's another belt from that time. This is another belt that you see mentioned in historical records. It's a council belt. And I love this belt because at the center, it looks like there's the white roots of the Great Tree of Peace going in the 4 cardinal directions. So when a big council was held, everyone was welcome to go and attend. Whether you were delivering belts or receiving belts or not, it was a public event. It was right out in the open underneath the sunlight so that anybody could see what was being discussed, so everyone could listen. So I love that. We're getting to the end. So this belt is associated with Haudenosaunee. Eventually, Haudenosaunee was asked to take the place of Mohawks from the Mohawk Valley who had left the Mohawk Valley after the American Revolution and moved to the Six Nations Reserve and also to the Tyanaga Reserve near the Bay of Quinte. And it is said that because there were no more Mohawks left in the old Confederacy in New York State, that they came to Haudenosaunee and asked some of the people, because the border goes right through Haudenosaunee and some of their communities in New York State. They asked if some of our ancestors would serve as the Mohawk chiefs. One of them was Philip Tarbell, was my great grandfather, and he was a Wolf Clan chief at that time. So they say that this belt was given to us at that time. Anyway, the last belt I have in my collection has an interesting pattern. The real belt is in the museum in France, and nobody knows what it means. There's no record of anything associated with this belt. But when you look carefully at the symbol, it kind of has a whirlwind pattern. It may be a reference to the Big Dipper going around the North Star here. So it kind of has that pattern. So I wanted to include this belt in my collection because we don't know the true story. We can only hypothesize what it might mean. So it represents all those belts that we haven't yet recovered, we haven't repatriated, that the story is lost. So the story to all these other belts, we kind of know what they mean, but there's a few missing relatives out there that we just don't know the story to. So I want to have at least one belt that represents those mystery belts that are still out there. Anyway, that brings me to the end of my wampum collection. And there's a lot more history, of course. We had another war, the War of 1812. The War of 1812 represented the end of the wampum era. That was when they stopped making wampum belts to give to Native people. That was when they stopped having us fight at separate war parties, doing battle in Native attire with war clubs and tomahawks and war paint. By the time of the American Civil War, if we went to fight for anybody, we had to dress up, we had to be uniformed, we had to have muskets and stand in rows with everyone else and get shot. So the old way of North American life had come to an end. We're now living in the reservation period. It was a whole different ballgame. We were no longer given the respect of nation-to-nation relationship. We were now a subjugated, they say conquered, but we weren't really conquered. Anyway, so that was the beginning of the reservation period. And wampum became an artifact, something that collectors would come in, purchase for a lot of money or not a lot of money, and then it would end up in a museum. So we were disconnected from the history and the teachings that go with the belts when they leave our possession. So we entered into another dark time. Well, in the modern era, now we're getting the belts back. They're being repatriated because of the federal law in the United States that requires museums, universities to return human remains and ceremonial items. So after a lot of lobbying, we were able to get back our monuments. So they're returning to us, and sometimes the story comes back, sometimes it doesn't. So it's left to historians and researchers like me to go and try to recover the knowledge that might have been lost or misplaced, and try to reconstruct the narrative of our history. So that's what I've been doing for the last 30 years, is doing my best to study wampum, to study the archival records, and to reconnect the story with the belt as much as I can. I've been successful to a certain degree, but others have also been contributing to this rebuilding of the knowledge base. I like to single out one of those people was Elder Ray Fadden. Haudenosaunee was his Mohawk name. And he was a school teacher here in Akwesasne in the 1930s. And he was one of those people that taught the youth to be proud of their culture. Whereas every other teacher was just telling us, learn to read and write and get a job. Forget about all that other stuff. But Ray Fadden said, no, how dare you? That culture is rich heritage, and you should celebrate it. Don't try to cover up, don't try to forget it. He made more than 50, probably 80 wampum belt replicas, and he used them to teach the students, to revive that fire burning inside of them, to keep them loving who they are and feeling positive about the past. So I'm just proud to be another person continuing that tradition of bringing this back to the people, to give them something that they should have had all along. And it's done me a lot of good to be a part of that kind of process. It's gotten me out into the world and giving these talks at universities and libraries and museums in the Eastern Seaboard, in Ontario, Quebec, New York State, Pennsylvania, Vermont. And I've been as far as Virginia, and I've also spoken at Winnipeg, and furthest I got was Santa Fe, New Mexico, talking about wampum belts. So I'm going to leave it at that. And if anybody has any questions, hopefully they can get back through this smartphone back to me, and I'll be happy to answer them as best I can. So, go.
That's great, Darren. Thank you so much. I don't know if you can hear me. I hope everybody else can. I'm going to ask Glenn to turn on the microphones of our participants. I'll just begin the question session, if I could, with a comment. This is the second time I've heard you give this presentation, and it's just started sinking into me how important active listening is in this tradition of wampum weaving and speech making. I wonder if you could comment a little further on this relationship between wampum and the stories that they are that people read into them. Was that one of the functions of chiefs in the ancient council fires, to actually remember the stories and pass them on? They must have had incredible memories, for starters.
Yeah, well, in those days, people didn't have anything else to go by. All they had were wampum belts and their memories. They didn't have writing, they didn't have smartphones, they didn't have computers or anything. So that muscle in your head gets very strong, and those people had incredible memories. And like I said, they usually had a trainee with them who was listening and who was tested on this knowledge so that he could carry it on. That was the primary function of the chief, was to carry that knowledge forward into the future.
Were there actual people assigned in the communities to make wampum belts? Was that like a craft, a specialty, in your knowledge?
Yeah, there were, everybody was a craft person back then. Everybody made stuff. Even little kids would weave fibers into little strings and ropes and stuff. So making things was an everyday thing that everybody did. But I imagine that the finer craftspeople were called upon to make the beads, the beaded belts, because to work with the original belts, which are actually smaller than these, the original beads were really tiny, and they really required a really skillful hand to weave them together. So yeah, it probably would have been women. That's what I've always heard, was the women that made the wampum belts. And so yeah, it was a specialized skill.
Would anybody else like to ask Darren a question at this moment? I think there's a feature that allows you to raise your hand, but even if you were just to wave at me or begin to speak, I think you'll be heard. Janet?
Yes, I wanted to ask Darren about the creation stories and how they differ. Like in a geographical region, would they would the various communities have similar creation stories, or?
Yeah, there's a little bit of similarity to a lot of the creation stories. Like among the Iroquois, a lot of our creation stories are very, very similar. But among the Algonquian people, they also have parallels to our creation story also. For instance, the Micmac and some of the Algonquian tribes have two primordial beings who are in conflict. Just like in our creation story, we have the two twins, the left-handed twin and the right-handed twin, who did battle for dominion over Earth. Well, that's a common metaphor among, for instance, the Micmac talk about Glooskap. He is the equivalent of the good twin of our creation story. So there's similar elements, but they all have their variations that mean something to each of them. I haven't studied all of them, but I do see that there are some very pertinent parallels.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Paul, would you like to ask a question? Is that?
Yes, I'd like to add something. Thank you. First, to thank you, Darren Bonaparte, for this incredible presentation. I hope someday to see you and the presentation in person, and maybe through Quan we can keep track of your numerous talks. I'd just like to add that wampum seem to be coming out of personal family homes and archives to be given to museums. I'm sure you're familiar with that. But 2 years ago at the Native Presence in Georgeville, Quebec, a woman offered a wampum, and we were lucky enough to have Liz Abumsawin from Odanak, who convinced her to donate it to that museum along with the story, the family story connected. So I'm very pleased and to know that people are sharing and preserving their family heritage. Thank you.
That sounds awesome. I don't know what else to say about that.
I have a question that has come through us through Facebook. The question comes from Heather Dart. She would like to ask you, Darren, can anyone or could anyone read wampum, or was there special training required? And a second part of that question is, could clan mothers read wampum also?
Well, it's not so much reading. Like a lot of people assume that you could just, like, say you went to an auction and the new wampum belt suddenly, came forward from God knows where, that you could just take that belt to the Confederacy, roll it out, and have them read it like a document. It's not quite that simple. Like I said, these were woven to accompany speeches, and you kind of had to remember that speech and continue to carry that on. So the symbols might not always reflect what was said in the belt. So it was an important thing that it was the oral tradition plus the mnemonic device. So to be able to read a belt, like there are some belts, I'll look at it and I know right away that's a covenant chain belt, or a peace belt, or a war belt, based on the symbols of it. But I don't know the full context of the belt. That's why it's important that they have those people continually teaching and conveying into the future. Because when they leave our position and end up in a museum for 100 years, it's real easy for that story to be severed and just cut off. So we have to reconstruct it.
It's just incredible work that you've done to reconstruct the narratives that you have done. I have another question here from Barbara Daibo. It comes to us from Facebook. I think she's asking, how can people learn more? How can people learn more about wampum, the history that it contains? I can answer that with one place to go would be to go to Darren's website, which is www.wampumchronicles.com. But perhaps you have other suggestions as well, Darren.
Well, there's a lot of books out there available. There's a lot of old, out-of-date books that you can find them online. You can just download a PDF of them. William Beecham did a big study of the wampum belts in, I think the early 1900s. That was put out by the New York State Museum, so you might be able to find that online. There's also a book by Ray Fadden, the teacher that I talked about. He wrote a book about Wampum. There are new anthropological articles. There's a lot of research out there, and like I say, it's not all in one place. You really have to do the research to sniff it out.
I was wondering about the War of 1812 and Charles Cook back then. Did he ever occur to bring a wampum somewhere?
Charles Cook?
Cook.
There's a Colonel Lewis Cook.
Yeah, Lewis Cook. Sorry about that. Yes.
And he lived in Haudenosaunee for a time, and he was a general in the War of 1812.
Mm-hmm.
And he did carry wampum because he had to engage in treaty councils with other nations. So he was known to carry wampum with him.
Okay.
I have another question that has come from Facebook. It's from Sarah Ann Gauntlet. She would like you to comment on the ethics and protocols for reproducing wampum, I guess today. Well, she says about the past and the present. I think you talked a bit about, you know, who in the community would make them, but perhaps you could expand on that. Was there a certain custom, ethics or custom in the community around the making of wampum records? And has that carried on to the present day?
Well, to me, the making of wampum, the actual weaving of belts was something that was determined by the chiefs and the clan mothers. When they were planning diplomacy, they would be in charge of that. That was part of their game. But anybody can make a wampum. Anybody can weave. If you can purchase wampum, you can buy it online, for instance, the real stuff today. Anybody can make it. You can make necklaces, headbands, whatever you want. So it's just a substance. It's only when it's officially used by the chiefs and the confederacies and used in diplomacy, then it takes on a different stature. But there's everyday kind of uses for it also.
Wonderful. Thank you. I think that brings to a close our session today. A big thank you to Darren for putting up with the awkwardness of Zoom format. I know it's a bit, well, it's just clumsy, frankly. I'm sorry that we couldn't have done this in person, but I look forward to the day when we can. Thank you all for joining us today. Your comments and feedback are always welcome, even after we close the session, as we will in a minute. And yes, please keep in touch. I think we've managed to make a recording of this, which we may be able to put up on our Facebook page. I have to figure out how to do that with Glenn later. But once again, thank you very much, Darren. Nyawen.
Yo.
Bye-bye. Bye, everybody.